Let me introduce you to Professor Diana Matallana. She is a highly important person for peace building and creating links among different fields and practices and science and a fighter for the peace of this country. So thank you, Diana, for joining us and for your work. You may proceed. Thank you, Andy. Okay, thank you for your invitation. And I modified a little bit the title of the component. These are interventions from neuroscience to promote conflict resolution. Today, unfortunately, my co authors didn't join us. This is the first time that you will hear progress of a book, The Skin of the Conflict, that is going to be published in November this year. And the three academic editors are Isabel Cristina Cuellar Rios, she's a dermatologist, Carlos Gomez, he's a psychiatrist, and myself, I am a neuropsychologist and neuroscientist. We always do this at the end, but for me it's important to highlight that the skin of the conflict is a work that we have been working on for at least 3 years, approximately, and involves many people. I already told you who the academic editors are. We are all from the School of Medicine, medical school. The photographs are from Javeriana in Vista Hermosa, where we did that, and we have a guest professor from the School of Social Communications and Languages from Universidad Javeriana, Germán Ortegón Pérez, who is a photographer, is an amazing photographer in Vista Hermosa. The interviews were conducted by Carlos Gomez, myself, Miguel Uribe, who you met earlier, Juan David Páramo, Isabel Cuellar, who was the dermatologist, and some said I also want to conduct interviews because that's highly interesting. We conducted a dermatological test on all participants by Isabel and Daniela Chaparro. The prologue was just submitted by Francisco de Rue. It is a great forward and an edit of the narration, which was done by Natalia Salamanca from the School of Communication, and then she joined the Commission of Truth. And the liaison, but the editors told me it's not a liaison, but our liaison with the population is Liliana Gaitán Londoño, who actually signed the peace agreement, the final peace agreement in 2016. I will now briefly move on to tell you that the group that is behind this initiative in research and academic component, and this was briefly explained by Dr. Gomez on how we build this book and work on peace processes when our background is clinical and we work on neurodegenerative diseases that are highly complicated or complex. So there are many from the group and here today, and I'm gonna briefly describe what we've done. My clinical work in general is with neurodegenerative diseases that start at an early onset. These are patients that we study from the clinical perspective, their cell biology, imaging, and in that regard, how we ended up working on this field. The university, for you who don't know, this is the university, our hospital, which is the San Ignacio Hospital, Intelectos, which is our genetics, the library. The background to get to this point is that we work with neurodegenerative diseases, especially the front lobe dementia. Those who have not heard about it, this is a disease that affects mainly our social behavior. So people that were normal, something goes wrong in their brain, they stop behaving normal socially, and these clusters brain diseases that affects a specific section of the brain, And these areas of the brain are associated with the normal development of personality and social behavior and language. We work mainly, this is our main field. Based on this, the dementia of the frontal lobe, we started investigating what happened in the brain in those patients that had social cognition complications. What happened, for example, there is an article that the first author is Hernando Santamaria, that is part of those hardships in behavior is jealousy with so many variables among those individuals. We studied the genetics of the persons with these diseases, the social drivers or determinants, and the relationship with the cognitive skills of these people who are not empathic and who have these complicated alterations. We also took a look at empathy, at moral judgment, all those variables of social condition. And we even, from this perspective, we also examine associations of individual factors of, health and violence. So we research this type of dementia and how this type of dementia, we started inquiring what happened on individuals of the population in general who don't have an injury, but quote unquote, you wonder whether if they lack the capacity to have social cognition or empathy. And as the dean told you, we dare to conduct a mental health survey with over 10,000 participants, asking them how they recognize or identified emotions, how they classified bad behaviors as positive or negative, and some results as were interesting. Some more religious places tend to punish what has no intention and those sort of things. And then we started studying what happens in the human brain, or that was our intention, in the population that we discussed earlier, as Dr. Boaz mentioned. What happens to Colombians that sometimes we lack empathy without being ill? So this led us to think how we move from the evolution of social cognition, because the phylogenetic and ontogenetic evolution is a recent milestone of neuroscience. This is relatively a new field. And today we know that we have ancestors that evolved from approximately 1 million, 2 million years ago, which are chimps and bonobos. They suffered a brain specialization, which was reflected in a bigger complexity of social behavior. And today we know that, for example, bonobos, when they are chimps, that they are not as similar as gorillas are to us, but the bonobos are tiny, and this chimp evolved to the point that we consider to be the closest relative at a social dimension. They, for example, have sexual relationships just for pleasure and not for reproduction. In addition to the human being, there are the other species, and they have complex human relationships. They adopt children, they exhibit solidarity. Another day we may dive into this topic because it's fun. This jump that we started to see in this bonobo study reveals two landmarks in or milestones in neuroscience that I would like to exhibit them in two slides. One is that in 1939, Von Economo, he drew some neurons of the brain, and he drew these neurons. These are photographs, and he said, I have no idea what this is. I'm not sure what they are for, but they are all inside the brain cortex in the front and frontal. And today we know that these cells are clearly social cells. We may call them social cells. And it seems that not only humans have those, but also bonobos, and those primates that are close to us who exhibit social behaviors. That was the first milestone. And the second one is the mirror neurons, which are more known, described by Professor Rick Solati. And what he did was record the activity of a motor neuron while a chimp observed the other one. So, based on imitation, the one who was observing, it seemed to have a perfect understanding of the intention of the other without the other chimp. And when the other chimp wasn't doing anything, his brain worked exactly as the one that was doing something. So these two neuroscience milestones, they drove social neuroscience. Before, social development was mainly concentrated in social sciences, but from this point we are taking the lead. These two landmarks have been pivotal. And the second landmark, the most important thing, is that it revealed that these neurons are only being produced uh, 1 or 2 weeks before they start developing at the 34th week of pregnancy. After the baby is born, they they keep forming, but then they pause. And this pause, so the number of these neurons that we will have until we are adults, it's defined when we are 4 years old. So when the children is barely able to understand what's right, what's wrong, learn to suffer when he or she sees the other, because a 2-year-old kid is difficult to say don't hit the dog because the dog is gonna suffer. They don't understand it. But today we have this evidence. This is an image of the brain, and it shows that the density of these cells, of these neurons in the human brain, is bigger than in our close species. And we have found these cells in whales, in elephants, and in certain mammals that are exhibit some complexity. Having said that, we ask ourselves how to create interventions from a neuroscience perspective. What I just told you is that today we know that we are biologically wired for social behaviors, for complex social behaviors, solidarity, pro-social, empathy. It is not true that when we insult the others that we are all psychopaths. Psychopathy is a very strange illness. Sociopathy, we would need to do another conference because it's something sort of more or less learned. But because it is learned, it doesn't mean that the brain of that person doesn't have the right neurons to be pro-social. We know that when these areas, when these mirror neurons are damaged, are hurt, these areas are damaged in a person with psychopathy. There is evidence that people with psychopathy, these neurons didn't develop well, or in people with autism. And it doesn't mean that they're bad, but they have difficulties to exhibit pro-social behaviors. It happens in frontal lobe dementia, which is when we started this, and also in autism and in schizophrenia. And we know that the culture, not biology, may affect social behavior. What happens is that we learn how to reactivate our wiring, our biological wiring, to be able to develop interventions. And this is where our project started. It's called the Skin of Conflict, and this started in Vista Hermosa, which is a municipality in the uh, Western Plains, and it's called Vista Hermosa because it names derived from the great landscape of the Macarena mountain range. You are seeing a picture of a river, Caño Cristales, and this mountain range joins the Jugar River. And when we take a look at all this area, this is more or less an urban area, but within a rural area. And here, this is the first reserve, which is the Sierra de la Macarena National Park. You that are visiting us are welcome to visit. This is a moment where the river is beautiful. Unfortunately, in this place, we suffered a lot of violence throughout the conflict. During the first visit that the university conducted on Vista Hermosa, when they were just starting to create the territorial training and peace plans, former combatants had not been disarmed. And Dr. Isabella, for example, Dr. Isabel had to do health skin attention, and when she saw all the injuries, for example, leishmaniasis, which were not so common, and you will see them soon. And then we got the idea of conducting a study, and we resumed in 2019, and I wanted to gather those narratives to see the stories of those former combatants. The story of Vista Hermosa is marked by the Colombian armed conflict, in which all armed groups have intervened. This is a place that didn't have a hospital during the conflict because doctors were not allowed to work there. The fight between paramilitary groups and former FARC combatants, and the zone was filled with cocaine crops. It was like an atomic bomb for all those who were there. As you can see, these are the pictures of Professor Herman, and these are the school and houses that are still damaged. So this um, started, and in this project that we started, we tried to run a pilot test to identify those things that they had in the skin and in their health and in their mental health that were derived from the war, as we all know. And we also wanted to hear and collect the narratives from the conflict in the voices of former combatants, former troops who probably won't render testimonies, and in the civil population who stayed in Vista Hermosa. We recruited individuals based on if they had a skin injury related to the conflict. The book has 4 chapters. The first one is skin and because we deal with and bruises because it deals with fire bombs, and each picture, as in this case, has a dermatological description. Here, for example, the third finger in the right, you see a break, a fracture caused by an injury by a bullet. We didn't want to number them, but include a caption of what we collected in these stories. This was the commander. Stress, for example, you see outbreaks because of chemical uses, chemical and stains, and you can see here in their feet. I couldn't get the shoulder. You can see these colorless injuries for those who had contact with chemicals involved in cocaine production. This is a woman that wanted to stay anonymous. Uh, this woman didn't even want to say her name, and these are the spots that you can see from the sun. She never left Vista Hermosa, and we'll see why. And their skin. This is the chapter 3, which is skin and sun, and for this skin and tropical diseases, which in this case, for example, we can see at the right ear 3 bruises due to leishmaniasis on the skin, active leishmaniasis on the skin. So this is just an advance because when you have the book, I'm not sure you're gonna buy it or it's a gift, but before we go over the first case, the objective of the book is to do what all of you have discussed this morning throughout the event. how to humanize those individuals, and who are going to see and hear those individuals. The idea is to then do a sample, and then you'll see the audio formats. The first idea from neuroscience is, let's raise awareness, and Bruno and Andres, let's humanize by seeing injuries. And these are the best injuries because there are some that are stronger and some strong narratives as well. And then let's read the stories. As I mentioned, all cases have something that identify the individual in the place or history. This is the Nukak case. This is an indigenous person. He starts talking. To understand him is a bit complicated. We will hear him soon, but he tells that he was starting in the peace process. He is a little bit disoriented regarding time, that he had been involved in the peace process for 1 month, but the war kept on going, and that was the reason that they hurt him on his leg. Sometimes I have to. I wanna. It's April 3rd. And when you felt the bullet, so he was shot by a machine gun on his leg, and that was how they got me. It was not a combat, it was an attack. My colleagues picked me up, so when they conducted the attack, no, no, they hurt you just to get you alive. They want you alive. The attack was from the army against you, right? Yes. So they left, and what did you do? We left because they always try to hit you at the leg so that they're able to get you alive, to get information from you. And then, but did they get you? No, they tried to rescue me, and as it's always like that, you cannot leave your other man behind. The key part of this story, and it lasts hours, is that he explains, and this is something that's common in all descriptions, is that the first thing that happened is that his comrades saved him, and they start describing the hospitals, how they're rescued or saved. This is a very interesting case, but we started with the first strategy, which is see the injury, and then the second strategy is to describe the injury with a story. And it's different than just seeing it because you can hear the story, and sometimes it's very tough. Sometimes there's crying, and we believe that it mixes two findings that are clear for neuroscience. The first, the way in which we can see empathy in CT scans when we research empathy, is when you see the physical pain of another person. If you're watching a soccer game and you see the injury, even if you don't play soccer, you jump. And this here you may see the injury, and these are complex. And also you hear the story. So by sensibilizing yourself with physical pain and also hearing the story. It's April 3rd. I'm with Albedo and Dr. Isabel. Okay. We have impact stories that are very strong, but they don't tell those stories with anger. Since the first visit, they just tell the story. Yeah, I was crossing the river, and then the boat came, and This one, for example, this is a long story. I'm not selling the book, but it seems like it. You'll see that this is a long story. It's very interesting. It's a true warrior. We named it Rambo, but then this is the warrior of the rifle, and he tells the story about this injury, even though he has many others. And he's describing an attack against a home, against paramilitary groups. And when he was reaching the door, he had to drop to the floor. And we told him, but they would have killed you. And he said, it would have been better because then you may rest from the hell of this war. So when you felt the bullet, what did you feel? And he said, I was burned, and because I was standing on my shoulder, um, this arm, and I was moving it, and I felt like needles, like I was watching a mountain higher than, and it was painful. So the bone was exposed, yes, but when I started backing up, my arm almost was ripped away, was ripped off. They're using a term in Spanish. Yeah, my arm was moving back and forward. My arm. Imagine the bone, the open bone, the bone out of the open. So he was almost split in half. Yes. Then I stood up and I said, "Okay, kill me." And someone was telling me, "Why don't you just stand up?" And I was trying to stand up, and I was just saying, "If they're gonna kill me, they just kill me." And I was crying on pain, with pain. It was so painful, and my arm was just moving. And I took my rifle or my gun, and they told me, "Give me that gun." And I said, "No, I'm taking the gun. And whatever happens, I also know how to shoot with this other hand." And I was carrying my gun, and I just saw the fire, and I was crying. I had fear, to be honest. So you have a story, and the story itself is strong. Uh, when you get the chance to read the book, you'll see. And this is from the civil population because these are scars on the skin, and here it's unfortunately that Dr. Miguel left because he helped us. Something that I've taken that from my efforts, right? It's been the result of my efforts, right? And because you decided to stay. She never left the town. She made sure that her family went away, and she lost her children. It was taken when her kid was 13 years old. Yeah, I've decided to stay because I'm hopeful to see if I was able to rescue my son. I stayed to try to rescue my son because as a mother, that's something that you can overcome that. There's no way to overcome that. You can want it all you want, and life goes on, but you cannot overcome the loss of a child. And what part of your body hurts? That's something that you carry.
Okay, and here for the sake of time, she at some point starts crying. So, yeah, her body never stops soaring, her hands, everything aches. Is one of the only women who told us I would I planned coke. I was the only because it was the only thing, the only way to make a living. So the only way to feel the sun on the skin, and that's when I felt. I mean, the skin, as we see here on this picture, and her skin also made us cry and everything because she was always in pain. So in this case, I won't talk anymore about the skin of the conflict, but it's a book that was very touching. And now, when I finish, I want to give an answer to one of the questions that were asked by why does it touch me and why now I feel moved when seeing the other. What I want to see is that most of the cases of social interaction provide large amount of information about the conditions or status of other persons, whether it's feelings, thoughts, ideas, convictions. You need to anyway to have certain affinity. You were saying you were talking about this morning, feeling like in the same group, etc. But we today, thanks to those studies and those landmarks and studies in neuroscience, we know so how we represent those states has been something important for the social neurosciences, and it gives place to the identification of two paths for understanding. The thinking about myself and us. There is an effective path that is where there is direct exchange with emotions. We know about that from others. So what we could simplify here is about how, or as empathy. What does neurologically it means, and so how much you feel hungry, how cold you feel, how hotter you feel, and the middle single cortex that is where and there is a cognitive path that is the most complex because it's that we are going to need to re-feel what the other one is feeling, thinking, reasoning about the states of others, and which means from the neurological, this union of a part of the brain that is more posterior than the anterior areas, but in the temporal areas in many aspects of the brain. So, what makes us to some of us empathize with the sample of the witness. What we know about the most primary that doesn't need any reasoning are emotions. So I think that any experiment held needs to include some emotions in the measurement and in the generation, giving the evidence of different paths. The efforts that we need to make from neuroscience need to be aimed at thinking about how to do it from neuroscience and having clear that it's not enough associating the changes before and after what we can observe through images like a hair or the skin or visual follow-up or pupils, which are good alternatives to check whether the change that we want to do is being done. That is what usually the theory of economy of behavior does, or the social sciences. They're quite good. But I need a change that is more precise, more. I mean, I need to change that cortex and see how we end. The suggestions that I can make based on this work and all the work of years thinking about peace. So we might need to measure first long-term changes. We have talked about that with Andres. We might need some other things to check if we actually can have immediate transformation or not. Probably finding some modalities of change depending on the groups, as Dr. Bruno presented this, and he presented that in the video. Maybe the dehumanizing, the humanization strategy, a strategy to humanize the other, and we can find that. But for me, I think that we need to find some deceitful paths for those who don't want to hear. I think that, we find here, I don't find the others. And I think that the strategy is not talking with the title FARC. So the movie is the FARC walkers, or the FARC, not including FARC in the titles. We need to start being deceitful. Let's go to see a movie or some art because otherwise we won't attract people. But here we are very sensitive. We cry with everything we see. What happened with the Jews? What happened with the Jewish people? They develop a full industry that today there are still movies that make you cry, and I am sure that many deniers said No, no, no. But I think that I mean, you cry even seeing life is beautiful. So, and that was a discussion that I had in my film festival in Cartagena. That there were a lot of documentaries about the conflict, and I said, "Isn't it that we need to go to the fiction, and whatever happens, from the documentary, in the experiment, in the fiction, we have to include physical pain. That is the secret from neuroscience. We need to include pain, physical pain, probably moving from documentary to fiction. In Cartagena, a lot of documentaries and many good of them, they tell us documentaries have a lot of exposure, but I mean, it's the same people who always watch them. So we need to invite those who don't want to watch, right? So we need to find and go ahead with a movie. And the last slide is it's either that or just waiting for this next one that I said that I go to aggressiveness, waiting to have new technologies available that science already has, that it's a force and colonizing with the neurons that could be made, and that's where we're gonna make, because there are experiments with octogenetics in animal models with uh, low temporal dementia that they have simulated with autism that they have recreated, and octogenetics, what it does is they put in like some kind of observer, like carrying even uh, some kind of good viruses that somehow colonize a part that is already, I mean, that fixes the brain. I don't want to get complicated because we can have another lecture about that, but it's investigating the neurodynamics associated to the brain functions so that we can understand the mechanisms of the pathology. This clinical research in these animal models allows us to see live neurons correcting themselves or identifying those that are damaged. In the latest age here, the linear research, so uh, you can go with the camera, go there, fix the gene, like in science fiction. Actually, recently we had an excellent lecture uh, from her, that is Dr. Jorge Davila's daughter, who works today in MIT's lab, and she works exactly on experimenting in mice that intentionally became autistic, where the news are not only they can identify what they damage, but that it can also be fixed. So if we don't do our fiction with the music, with the tragedy, with the pain and things like that, so we could wait that it seems that it won't be long to go into the brain and colonize the brain with the Bonacol neurons. So I want to thank all those who gave their witness. They allowed us to see their skin, and from who we learned something about the personal history, who never got apart from the continued learning from our history. I think that we don't know the conflict. We know about the chiefs and the things but you don't know the life stories of each one of those people, where they come from, why they are convinced. Civil population, men and women, who stayed in Vista Hermosa with a hospital without roads, waiting for things to change, to former combatants and the recuperation in the ECTR in Vista Hermosa Meta, and to those that now reside in the country, to the medical directors, nurses in the Vista Hermosa hospitals, and thank you for listening.